So the very same year Amicus Productions released their classic Tales from the Crypt, they also released another horror anthology film, or portmanteau. This is called ASYLUM from 1972. Now this is the fifth horror anthology that Amicus made, and by this point they'd really established a formula. You pretty much knew how these movies were going to go. Well, they switched it up with ASYLUM. I would consider this the weirdest, the most unusual of all the films in this series. Let's talk about it. What's going on, everyone? Welcome again to the Cobwebs channel. My name is Daniel. Now, up to this point, most of these anthology horror films that we've been talking about in this long-running review series that I've been doing have been directed by Freddie Francis. Well, they're switching it up this time. This is directed by Roy Ward Baker. He made a bunch of movies for Hammer that I love, like Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, Quatermass and The Pit, The Vampire Lovers, and Scars of Dracula. Okay, he made that one too. But for the most part, it seemed like these old British horror producers called in Roy Ward Baker when they wanted to do something a little more unusual, a little more experimental, and I do think that's what we get with ASYLUM. Once again, written by Robert Bloch, this one kicks off with Dr. Martin, played by Robert Powell, who arrives at a secluded asylum for the incurably insane. He's there to interview for a job as one of the psychiatrists there at the asylum, and he meets with the head guy, who's played by Patrick McGee. Patrick McGee informs him that Dr. Starr was one of the head doctors of this asylum, but he has now gone insane himself. And now our Dr. Martin has got to go upstairs, talk to the incurably insane patients, and try to figure out which one is Dr. Starr. Now, right here, I just got to say, this is setting this movie up to have one of the best wraparounds of any of these Amicus anthologies, because this has added in a bit of suspense instead of just having some creepy guy tell the future of a bunch of different characters like a lot of these movies have gone. This movie is setting up an actual narrative within the wraparound and setting up a goal, a mystery to unravel as we look at the different horror segments. That's just brilliant. It's not just a framing device, it's something a little bit more. The first patient he goes to meet is Bonnie, played by Barbara Parkins, and we launch into the first segment, which is called Frozen Fear. Now, while this is Bonnie's story, she's not really the main character of this segment. She is the mistress of the guy that we're mostly going to follow through this, Walter, played by Richard Todd. We watch Walter have a confrontation with his wife, Ruth, where she confronts him about the fact that he was cheating on her, and he assures her he's not doing that anymore. But we also get a sense that, one, Ruth is very controlling. She makes it very clear she controls the money in the relationship, and she's a bit belittling of Walter. And we find out that she is interested in some sort of voodoo witchcraft of some kind, and Walter definitely doesn't approve. But if you know anything about Amicus anthologies and you see people having an affair, you know somebody's gotta die. So yes, Walter axe murders his wife right after showing her a present he's got her, which is a freezer. I mean, that's just practical. That's just going to come in handy right away. Though we don't actually see any of the gore, we find out that he has chopped up his wife into a bunch of little pieces, wrapped them all in brown parchment paper, and stores them all in the freezer. He's about to run away with his mistress Bonnie when he discovers that each and every body part of Ruth is alive. Now, all these individual body parts moving around, it's such a great image, especially the head. They have this really, actually, effectively spooky sequence where you watch the head breathing. It's really cool, and honestly, the fact that it's all wrapped in brown paper, I think makes it a little bit more effective. Now, for one thing, I think they did that for practical reasons. You can't quite get that gory in a 1972 Amicus movie, but also you know it would just look hokier if it was just a head. But the fact that there's an unknown aspect to it, it's all wrapped and covered, but you know it's alive in there, that's just spooky to me. And you know, it's one of the most effective images of the film because they got it front and center on the Severin Blu-ray cover. Now, I'm definitely a fan of this segment. It doesn't exactly have a ton of atmosphere to it. I think that's a pretty consistent thing with this movie. The asylum itself is a pretty good atmosphere. Most of the segments are, well, they're fairly drab looking. And this one is guilty of that as well. But the performances are very good. And it's just fun. It's just really fun to watch all these limbs just hop around on their own. I just love love the image of all these body parts crawling after Bonnie. I mean, honestly, it kind of reminds me of the broken toys going after Sid in Toy Story.
Your toys, because if you don't, we'll find out, Sid.
I mean, it's a far cry from the guy having an affair segment in Tales from the Crypt. This one is definitely way better. Now, at this point, Dr. Martin is not quite so sure that Bonnie is Dr. Starr, so he goes to talk to the next patient, who is Bruno, played by Barry Morse. And here we launch into the second segment, called The Weird Tailor. So Bruno is a struggling tailor. I don't know if I would call him weird, that just seems mean, but definitely down on his luck. We open up with him arguing with his landlord about his inability to pay the rent for his business space. He's just not sure what he's going to do. But lo and behold, a mysterious customer comes in that just might solve his problems. And this customer is played by none other than Peter Cushing. Here we are. You have been wondering, when is Peter Cushing going to show up in this thing? Here he is. So good to see him. And Peter Cushing comes in with an expensive job that could solve all of Bruno's money problems, but with some very specific instructions. He brings in his own material and says the suit must be made from this, and the suit must be made only between the hours of midnight and 5 o'clock in the morning. He explains this bizarre request away as him being a believer in astrology, but he really has these very specific specifications for the suit that he wants to give to his son. Now, since Bruno is down on his luck, he certainly doesn't want to take any chances with the amount of money he's going to get from Cushing, so he agrees to it and goes ahead and makes the suit. And right here, I got to stop and say one of my favorite things about this segment is the way it just kept me guessing. It was just really fun to be kept in suspense through this whole thing. What is going on? What does Cushing want with this suit? What is this material? Why does it only have to be made in the night hours? It really got my hopes up for an interesting payoff, because this doesn't seem like it's setting up any typical horror subgenre that we know of. Bruno finishes the suit and goes to deliver it to Peter Cushing right away, and there he discovers not only Cushing, but his son as well, who is a dead body. Right here, I just gotta say, I love how the dead body's head is the only part that they put makeup on, and just kind of hoped we wouldn't notice or wouldn't care. They're kind of right. I don't really care. It's just kind of charming. So by the time Bruno comes back to his place, still with the suit, because Peter Cushing didn't actually have the money for it, and they have a violent altercation about it, he tells his wife to burn this suit, but she doesn't. She puts it on their mannequin. And man, I just love the final moment of this. I think it's so fun watching the mannequin come alive, which I actually think is a really good image. It does look like a mannequin actually coming to life. And I think they did a great job with it. And this is just a segment that kept me guessing. I couldn't tell where it was going. And where it was going was satisfying for me. The performances are all great. I think this is definitely a great performance from Peter Cushing. A different character for him, still his very polite and friendly self, but something just very strange and sinister about him. You know, this should be called The Weird Customer. There's nothing weird about the tailor. Peter Cushing's the weird guy here. I love this segment, and this story was also adapted as an episode of the Boris Karloff hosted television show Thriller. Now, by this point, Dr. Martin is not convinced that Bruno is Dr. Starr, so he goes to meet the next patient, who is Barbara, played by Charlotte Rampling, and we go into the third segment, which is called Lucy Comes to Stay. Barbara is a young woman who insists that she is not insane, there's no reason for her to be here, and when the segment starts, we find out she's actually coming home from some kind of hospital to live with her brother, and her brother has gotten her a home nurse, which she's really not happy about. She wants her hospital days far behind her, and she's starting to suspect that this nurse is really like her babysitter, her keeper, and she really wants to visit with her friend Lucy, who is played by Britt Eklund. Yes, Britt Eklund as the iconic character Willow from The Wicker Man, one of my favorite movies of all time. So it's really cool to see a Wicker Man actor here. And Britt Eklund is definitely the peppy, fun character who seems to be tempting Barbara towards a bad path. Now, this is a movie where the final twist and what's really going on with Lucy, Britt Eklund's character, was so obvious, I genuinely didn't think it was going to be a twist. I thought that was just the story that they're telling. I guess I'm not going to say it here because who cares? It doesn't matter. It's just so blatantly obvious what that character is. And it wasn't until the final moment of this segment where I figured out, oh, they meant that to be a twist. They meant that to be a reveal. Overall, this story is pretty lame. I don't really care for it. I like the actors, but just nothing of much note really happens here. It's not very interesting. And like I said, the final reveal, it's just so blatantly obvious. There's almost even no point in having the reveal at all. But he's not so sure she's Dr. Starr, so Dr. Martin goes to talk to the next patient, who is Dr. Byron, played by Herbert Lom. Now, Herbert Lom's been in a whole bunch of stuff, but he will always be closest to my heart because he was Phantom of the Opera in the Hammer version of Phantom of the Opera, which is my personal favorite version of the story. So I was really happy to see Herbert Lom in this, and he's great. And he definitely seems like he's going to be Dr. Starr because he is a doctor. He talks about how he studied medicine, but he has a new passion now, and that is creating mannequins. He shows Dr. Martin all of these little robot-bodied but realistic-looking head dolls that he's made that are based on a bunch of people that he knew in his real life. They're actually pretty funny-looking, and he talks about it so seriously, about how they have functioning brains inside. They have real human organs inside, and all he has to do is learn how to transfer his consciousness into these dolls. It's so silly and pulpy. I just love it. And then Dr. Martin leaves the room. And I was so confused by this watching it. I was like taken aback. Like, what? We're not going to go into a segment that like he just goes in, has a quick conversation with him and leaves? Well, it turns out this final segment, which is called Mannequins of Horror, yes, it is called a segment and it has a name based on the end credits, really just folds into the wraparound, and the wraparound itself becomes the final segment. Now, there's not a lot of anthologies that do this, but one of my favorites is actually After Midnight. This is an underrated horror anthology from the 1980s. I think it's really good, and this is one where the wraparound just turns into the final segment really, really well, and Asylum is one of those cases. And while we never really knew if these other segments really happened or if these people are just insane, we do know that Dr. Byron does successfully transfer his consciousness into a mini version of himself, this little doll. And then this doll goes strutting out to go kill people. And the image of this little dude just like slowly walking around while this bombastic horror score just hits all over is like so funny. It's funny on its own, but just imagine if you just put different music to this. I mean, if you ask me, Trick or Treat Studios and NECA have put out enough Chucky dolls, okay? They put out enough Michael Myers masks. It's time to put out a doll of this little bozo. I mean, I need this guy in my movie room. I mean, tell me you wouldn't buy an actual replica of this little thing from Asylum. So the mannequin goes out, wreaks havoc, and I'm not going to give away the final twist to the movie. I just want you to see it. But it's really good, actually. It's really satisfying. I wasn't expecting it. And the movie ends with possibly the most unsettling, maniacal, evil laugh I have ever heard. I mean, every actor who's ever played the Joker, take note. This is creepy. So let's go ahead and rate this movie. Now, Frozen Fear, I'm going to give a 7 out of 10. I really do like it. I love the image of all these body parts coming after them. It's definitely not the most obvious place to take this affair gone wrong story. It's lacking atmosphere. It definitely doesn't have any characters you care about. I mean, much by design, but it's a lot of fun. Now, the weird tailor, I'm actually going to go with an 8. I kind of love this segment. I think it's consistently interesting. The performances are so good. The very dark tailor shop that it takes place in is definitely a little more atmospheric than most of the movie is. And come on, it's got Peter Cushing, and Peter Cushing is fantastic in it. And I just love that final moment. Lucy Comes to Stay, I'm going to give a 4. It's one of my least favorite segments in any of these Amicus movies. I like the actors, the performances, but just nothing of note really happens in this segment. And And the ending, it just ends with a whimper. I mean, who cares? Mannequins of Horror, and yes, I didn't spell that wrong. That is how the final credits spell mannequins, is very difficult to rate because do I just wrap this into the wraparound or take it as its own segment? The end credits of this movie take it as its own segment. So on its own, I'm going to give it a 7 because it's fun. It's ridiculous. The image of this little doll walking around is so funny because of how not menacing it is. It's got Herbert Long. Like, I love Herbert Long. I am so entertained by this final segment. It's just a blast. But to try to separate that from the wraparound, I think the wraparound is great. I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. I love how it creates its own narrative, its own device of suspense all around the segments it's going to tell. All in all, I'm going to give Asylum a 7 out of 10. I think it's a lot of fun. But if you want to hear more of my thoughts on Amicus films, click right over here for my review of Torture Garden, which is probably one of the most uneven Amicus movies. So it was really fun to review. And you can click this playlist right down here for all of the videos in my Amicus review series I'm doing right now. But if you enjoyed this, make sure to give a like and a subscribe so you don't miss future videos. Thank you so much for watching. With all that said, don't forget to enjoy yourself today, and I'll see you next time.